Hello everyone, and welcome to the Redacted Archives, where we explore true crime cases that disturb, unsettle, and linger long after the story ends. From unsolved mysteries to chilling confessions and forgotten files, each episode is crafted to immerse you in the darkest corners of the human nature. Viewer discretion is strongly advised. These stories are real and they are not easily forgotten. Some crimes don't just end when the victim dies. They continue in fear, rumors, and the damage left behind. The story of Karina Budachyan is one of these cases. The beginning of the 2000s becomes the epitome of new and rising subcultures such as goths, emos, metalheads. Now the case we dive into today is the true crime case which first captured my personal interest in true crime and murder. It involves a 16-year-old victim, allegations of cannibalism, ritual killing, dismemberment, and becomes one of the most known and scandalous cases in Russia of this era. Almost overnight, an entire subculture is dragged into the narrative. Goths, emos, punks, what was once misunderstood becomes feared. Now, the case didn't just take a life, it left a permanent stain on how alternative youth culture was seen, fueling more panic, suspicion, and a dangerous association between identity and violence. Tonight, we examine how Karina Budachyan was murdered and how one crime reshaped public perception, leaving a dark imprint that still lingers till this day. On one of January's cold and snowy days back in 2009, in the city of St. Petersburg, a 16-year-old girl by the name of Karina Budachyan comes home from school, goes to work, and disappears. Now her mother, Nadezhda, files for a missing person. However, as we often see in these cases, she's dismissed by the police and they tell her that she probably ran away and they're not going to take her report seriously. Now, the fact that Karina was an obedient girl who never came home late, who never had run away from home previously, didn't really persuade them to take the report seriously either. Meanwhile, days are going by with no sightseeings, no contact from Karina. And once the police officers finally begin working this missing persons case, they discover one minor detail, which eventually leads them to some answers. Now, this detail was in Karina's recently found interest in a subculture and the group of people surrounding her, which ends up leading to her grave. Now, at the time of her disappearance, she was a student, humanitarian by nature. She studied hard and was determined to set her path to university. While her family denies this, it has been confirmed that Karina had a newly found interest in the subcultures of goths and emos, which were rising in St. Petersburg at this time. She would keep this a secret from her family, however, would attend gatherings and concerts with some newly found friends in this group. This is how, in the fall of 2009, Karina attends a concert of the band Cherie and meets the 19-year-old lead singer Maxim Glavatsky, who also went by the name of Cherie. Now, he presented himself by wearing makeup, feminine clothes, was quite eccentric, which drew a lot of female attention to him. Other than his looks, he was also described as being quite charismatic and artistic. So yeah, it led to a lot of females being interested in him. Now, Karina becomes one of these girls and immediately falls in love with Cherie. She even shares this detail with her mother. I mean, it was her first love, and she would write him little poems in her diary. Cherie was born on the 27th of October in 1989, making him a Scorpio. He was born in a little town in Sosnovyy Bor in the Leningrad region. And once he graduated from school, he decided to move to St. Petersburg to pursue his music career. He soon becomes quite known in the circles of the goth and emo subcultures. And at the crisp age of 19, he had already had two minor convictions. One of them was for threatening to murder a close relative, and another one for animal cruelty. Now, alarm bells are probably ringing for most of us at this point, but these convictions were dropped, and instead he was placed in under psychiatric hold in a psychiatry, from which he's soon released. Upon his release, in the summer of 2008, Maxim or Cherie meets Yuri Mashnov, who also identified with the goth subculture, and they soon begin to rent an apartment together. Now, Yuri had also had previous hiccups with the law enforcement. He had previously been conditionally sentenced to 3 years for robbery back in 2005. Now, their new apartment became the new hotspot for parties, loud music, teenagers drinking, and the neighbors would often call the police on them because the music was so loud and they were making so much noise. However, whenever the police officer would come over for the disturbance call, they just wouldn't open the door, so there wasn't much they could do about it. Now, on the 19th of January, they had planned for yet another one of these parties in their apartment. Amongst the people that were supposed to be there was Yekaterina Zenovyeva, who was allegedly the owner of the apartment and also lived there at the time. But let's circle back to Karina for a moment and to how her day was planning out. Now, Karina comes home from school and she proceeds to go to work. She worked with putting up flyers around town, and actually a friend of hers joins her to keep her company during this time. Now, while she's out working, she makes a phone call to Cherie because, as we remember, she had already met him at this concert, was in love with him, so yeah, she would text him, she would call him. So yeah, during their conversation, he casually mentions that he's having this party later tonight, and she asks if she can come over with her friend. Now, Maxime describes that he said yes, but only on the condition that she would bring over booze because he thought of her as quite clingy and attached, which most likely she was in love for the first time. Now, Karina is quite happy to hear this, so she now needs to come up with an excuse to get allowance from her mom to go to this party. So Karina calls up her mom and she tells her that she remembered that she has this report due in school, but it needs to be written on a computer. And since they don't have a computer at this time, she asks if she can sleep over at her friend's house where they can finish this report together, because her friend, coincidentally, has a computer that she can borrow. So her mom is hesitant at first. She lets her know that, I'd rather have you come home tonight than get good grades on this thing. Like, whatever, just forget about it. Nothing is gonna happen if you don't finish up one assignment. But Karina convinces her to speak to her friend, and after speaking to her friend and getting reassurance that she's going to be sleeping over at her place, her mom says, yeah, that's fine, and Karina promises to be back home by 7 a.m. Now, once Karina got reassurance from her mom, her and her friend finished up work and began heading to the apartment of Maxime or Cherie. Now, a female who was already at the party witnessed a phone call between Cherie and Karina when he was giving her instructions on how to get to the apartment. And once he hung up the phone, he was heard saying, meat is on its way. Now, this statement will become very controversial considering how this case plays out, but Maxim's mother, in an interview, actually said that it was quite common for them to call girls whom they had not had sexual intercourse with as meat. Now, once the girls arrive at the party, Karina's friend said that everyone was drinking, the time was going by quickly, and before they knew it, it was about 10 p.m. So Karina's friend says to Karina, "Hey, are you ready to head home yet?" And Karina says, "No, I want to stay," and reassures her friend that she will crash at another friend's house and that she's free to go if she wants to. Now, around this time is when other guests also begin to leave, and finally, there's only 4 people left in the apartment: Cherie, or Maxime, that we mentioned earlier, Karina, Yuri, and Katya, who was the owner of the apartment, remember. Now, I will offer you a few different versions of what could have or might have transpired during that night. And first, we will dig into the official statement of the law enforcement. So according to their statement, on the evening of the 19th of January, Yuri and Maxime, who at that point had known each other for 3 months, got a spontaneous urge to kill Karina. In order to do this, they approached the owner of the apartment, Katya, and asked for permission to do this. Now, Katya obviously does not give them permission to murder Karina, and they just continue drinking. A few hours later, people are beginning to leave, and the owner, Katya, also leaves to attend an internet cafe. At 10 p.m., Karina's friend decides to leave, at which point Katya returns home, so to her flat that she owned, and goes to sleep. Now, Yuri stays up and plays computer games. Maxime and Karina are in the bedroom and then proceed to head to the bathroom to be alone. Maxime fills up a bath. Karina lays in the bath. Maxime gets undressed and then sits on top of her. Then Maxime signals Yuri 3 times by sneezing, following which Yuri comes into the bathroom and the 2 of them proceed to drown Karina. Both having an equal amount of involvement in the murder. Maxime is holding down her hands, her arms and legs, and Yuri is holding down her head underwater. Now, Katya, remember the owner who was sleeping, at this time was also present in the apartment. And around this time, 12 p.m., she goes up with the intent to use the bathroom, and she is stopped by Yuri, who informs her that Karina is now dead. Then they proceed to get rid of the corpse in a hurry. They dismember her and place her in trash bags, with the exception of the calf muscles, which they keep for themselves, cut up into small pieces and place on a baking tray alongside potatoes, herbs, and onions, which they then bake. Now, what involvement Katya, the owner of the flat, had in the dismemberment and the cannibalism act is unknown. Now, to get rid of the rest of the body parts, Yuri and Maxime place the bags inside a suitcase and carry it around their neighborhood, around the garbage stations, where they dispose of them one by one in different spots. Now, the personal belongings of Karina, some of them they kept, other belongings they sold. There's a few odd details about this statement, right? First of all, let's start with the fact that it lacks any sense of real motive for murder. Secondly, who goes on to ask a friend / owner of the apartment for permission to kill somebody in their flat, makes them aware of their intent to kill somebody, and then proceeds to do it any case when they're not giving that permission. And also while they're in the same apartment, right? That's a little odd, one might say. Something else that doesn't really add up is, remember how they say that Maxim signals Yuri 3 times by sneezing? First of all, how does one intentionally sneeze 3 times in a row? Like, is there no other more convenient signal that one can come up with? Yeah, just a thought. Now, according to the investigation notes, and in line with the final verdict, following dismemberment of Karina, as I mentioned earlier, they proceed to engage in acts of cannibalism by taking part of the calf muscle and proceeding to place it or to bake it on a tray alongside potatoes and some onions. However, the results of this baking tray, when they take it in for analysis, do not conclude that there's any traces of human blood or meat. And the only basis for this claim was that they got a confession out of Maxim and Yuri after holding them for the first 3 days after their arrest. Now, following these confessions, both Maxim and Yuri have come out saying that they were beaten into confessions and that they never, and stress that they never engaged in any acts of cannibalism. Now, what is also interesting is that at the time, in the criminal code of Russian Federation, there was no conviction for acts of cannibalism, meaning that even if they were alleged for having committed acts of cannibalism, they could not have been convicted for those acts alone. However, despite this, obviously, like the portrayal of these Goths who not only kill this poor 16-year-old and dismember her, but also eat her, is way more damaging in the eyes of jury and the eyes of the public. So maybe that's one reason why investigators wanted this confession out of them of cannibalism so badly. Now, another interesting fact is that for the whole year of the investigation, in the case file, all of the notes mentioned acts of cannibalism, but never specified which part of the body had allegedly been consumed. And only a year later, in the follow-up investigation, do they specify that it was the calf muscle that they had consumed. Now, coincidentally, the calf muscles is the only part of Karina's body that they had not discovered. The cannibalism accusations became a tool that transformed this crime into a monster horror story. Another allegation that came up was that allegedly Maxim, following the murder of Karina, drew a pentagram on her chest and was calling to the devil. These claims is what truly sensationalized this story. Now, let's take a look at the story from Maxim's angle, and this is how he describes the events of that night. I was drunk, I fell asleep, I woke up, and she was sitting on top of me and confessing her love for me. I thought of having sex with her, which would have meant nothing to me at the time because I slept with everyone. We went into the bathroom, she got undressed, I took a look at her, and I changed my mind. I'm a straightforward person, so I told her, there's something I don't like about you. So I changed my mind. She got upset, she got offended, and she was already drunk at this point, so she began yelling and screaming at me. At this point, Yuri heard her screams and runs into the bathroom. He starts yelling at her to stop screaming. Then, when that doesn't work, he grabs her by the hair and puts her head underwater. The walls were very thin in our apartment. Our neighbors had called the cops many times on us before. And also, I was mad at her because she was calling me an impotent and gay. So I didn't interfere in the whole thing. He would dip her head underwater, she would come back up and continue screaming. he would force her head underwater again. I didn't want to look at it anymore, so I left the bathroom and went for a smoke on the balcony. Now, at this point, Katya was already in the bathroom too. So, while all of this was going on, she must have choked on the water, or he must have held her there for too long. But they run to me at the balcony and they're in shock, and this is where I messed up. Instead of trying to save her, I thought, now, in any case, we're fucked. I blame the alcohol. Now, this was Maxim's statement, right? Now, let's go through Yuri's statement. According to Yuri, this is the way the night went. We had guests, they all went home. It was only me, Maxim, Karina, and her friend, and Katya left. Karina's friend started calling her to come home. Karina said, no, I want to stay, because they had agreed on this previously with Maxim. They went to the bathroom to be alone, while Katya went to sleep and I stayed up playing video games. There was a moment of me getting up and going towards the bathroom. I saw the light in there and the door was slightly open. So I entered and I saw Maxim in a strange state. He looked lost. Karina was underwater, and at that time, Katya also woke up and started heading towards the bathroom. I led her back into the room and told her, you don't know anything, you didn't see anything, go back to sleep. I returned to the bathroom and I check on Karina. I tried to spill hot water on her. I tried to spill cold water on her. Then I checked her pulse and nothing was working. At this point, I understood she was dead. It was terrible. I would have called the police, but I thought Maxim was my friend. This case became culturally dominant by sensationalized reality TV shows. Every single channel at the time was broadcasting these shows with the big headlines: Goths lure, kill, and eat 16-year-old girl. At these shows, they would interview Karina's grandmother, who believed all of the previously said accusations. They would have Maxim's brother and his mother also coming to these shows to contradict that he was at fault. And also a lot of their goth friends who would just come on as audiences or would come out with their own statements of what they thought might have transpired during that night. Now, another interesting version, which the mother gave during one of these interviews, was that she had a suspicion that her son was into extremist sex, and she suspects that during sexual intercourse, he might have strangled the girl in an attempt to achieve more ecstasy during the intercourse and probably overdid it, which is what led to her death. Now, unfortunately, we'll never know exactly what transpired that night, the full sequence of moments, the words spoken, the decisions made, and at what point everything became irreversible. But what we can say for sure is that the cannibalism accusations became a tool, one which transformed this case into a monster horror story. In the mid-2000s, Russian tabloids became obsessed with the terrifying headlines: Goths kill teenage girl and eat her. Now, before the actual trial, all of the TV shows at the time were broadcasting this story, which could not have left the jury or the members of the public unbiased. Now, Maxim and Yuri were convicted of being guilty for the murder and theft of personal belongings of Karina Budachyan and got sentenced to 18 and 19 years in prison. While in prison, Yuri continued to serve his sentence while making appeals for early releases, which did not produce any results. Meanwhile, Maxim or Cherie, while in prison, formed a rock group, got married, got very into philosophy, but despite this, he committed suicide on the 24th of March 2017. Maxim Blavatsky was found hung in his prison cell. He left a note asking for forgiveness for his crimes. When the case of Karina Budachyan faded from the headlines, one thing became clear. Nothing about the story truly ended. Karina lost her life. No interpretation, no theory, no narrative can change that fact. A young girl was killed, and the horror of her death could not be diluted by spectacle. But as the media searched for explanations, something else happened. The focus shifted away from who Karina was and towards what her killers supposedly represented. Words like ritual, dark, goth became shorthand for evil. Nuance disappeared and context was ignored. An entire subculture was flattened into caricature, dangerous, disturbed, inhuman. Goth culture, which for decades had been rooted in art, music, introspection, and emotional honesty, became linked to violence it did not create. For many people, that association never went away. Teenagers were judged by how they dressed, music became suspicious, self-expression became something to fear. Sensationalism replaced responsibility, fear replaced fact, and Karina herself slowly disappeared from the story bearing her name. Karina Budachyan deserved to be remembered as a person, not a symbol in a moral panic. And subcultures deserve to be understood, not blamed for the actions of the individuals. If there's anything to take away from this case, it's this. Violence does not come from music, clothes, or identity. It comes from human choices. And when we allow fear to rewrite reality, the damage doesn't stop with the victim. This case was of Karina Budachyan.